What your mother told you about first impressions is correct. They are important. But perhaps the deliverance of such a good first impression is a little more nuanced than you might have thought. And that's what I want to share with you today, how you can manipulate first impressions in pursuit of longer-term goals. And at the risk of sounding like a contemporary Christian Bale in American Psycho, I quote Machiavelli. I assure you I'm not a sociopath, I just happen to really like history. I could quote you Virgil, but that would be even more boring. Many authors have constructed imaginary republics and principalities that have never existed in practice and never could. For the gap between how people actually behave and how they ought to behave is so great that anyone who ignores everyday reality in order to live up to an ideal will soon discover that he has been taught how to destroy himself, not how to preserve himself. When I was in school, very early on, the first semester in the fall, I would always come in swinging. I was a clever kid, and I liked to speak out and have my opinions heard. And so for the first week or 2 weeks, I was always raising my hand, always interjecting some hopefully clever repartee, doing the homework. And the teachers liked me. They immediately recognized me as relatively intelligent. But then my general apathy and sloth-like behavior set in, and I stopped doing my homework and just relied on my ability to get a B on tests and skate by. And at the end of every semester, my teachers would always be like, such a waste of potential. You really dropped the ball. You started off strong, you went downhill. You're just not living up to your potential. You should be working harder. You don't work very hard. And this was a recurring theme in school. But when I started this school year in the class, quiet, diminutive, almost acting dumb, like I didn't know the answer, I was baffled, asking tentative questions, and over that semester, I would turn in more of my homework, seemed like I was more studious. The teachers had a more favorable impression of me. They always commented, you really you really grew into yourself. I feel like you really worked hard, you strived, you bettered yourself. They had a totally different opinion of me, even though my baseline intelligence was exactly the same, and my normative personality was the same throughout. The difference is because a first impression is like an initial sampling, and depending on whether there are subsequent data pulls on an individual or a sample, should influence how you approach a first impression. When you leave school, where there is a definitive endpoint, a beginning of a semester and the end of a semester, the opposite can be said of work. Because there's no definitive endpoint in work, there's no recurring sample, you can start the game very strong, working extra hard, putting in long hours, always being on top, well organized. And then after the first couple months, now that you've cemented this first impression that you are a hard worker, you can become slowly more lazy. You can phone it in a little more. Take those hours down, maybe not work as hard. And you can continue this trajectory, this slow sloping decline of energy or output, because work, when you're working in some sort of career-like job, has no refresh button. It has no definitive endpoint. And so the first impression that is set is very likely to remain if you gradually decrease your positive qualities or your work ethic. In school, where the teacher's reviewing, at the end of the semester, let's see, you started the grades strong and then went down and then you stopped turning in homework. Classic BostWiki, it was always slacking. And they could see, because that end of the semester forced them to refresh their opinion of me and reevaluate it, they could see what was actually occurring. And that first impression of me working really hard then worked against me later in the year because I got lazy. Whereas in most jobs, there is no refresh point. And that initial impression of you working hard and being on top of it and positive and friendly will remain long after you've phoned it in for years. And I've watched this happen with people that I've worked around me who put in time when they joined a company, worked very hard, and then dialed it back. Conversely, I've also watched the opposite happen at work. Where in school, if you start off almost dumb, like somebody out of Alice in Wonderland, Tweedledee, Tweedledum, come in there, stuttering, I don't know the answers. You're one of those people that, they're reading in class and you're stumbling over the words and you're acting like, oh, sorry, what page? I was snoozing. If that's how you start school, at the beginning of the semester, and then over time, you're like, oh yes, chapter 1, chapter 3, and your diction is perfect, your elocution is on point. It's great. The opposite is true at work. Because that initial impression, because there's no refresh point, I have seen, to the detriment of many poor souls, that they start work and they're unsure of themselves. They're not confident, they're meek in raising their hands, and it's because out of some sort of wanting to assimilate into the culture, and their baseline intelligence could be the same. Nonetheless, that first impression gets set that they're unassertive. They don't really know what's the right course of action. They don't work as hard as they should. Maybe they're just putting in 40 hours a week, a totally reasonable amount of time, but that gets set in stone because there is no refresh. There's no refresh of the data sample of the individual in careers often, not like there is in school. And so these people can never shake that first impression. They may grow more confident, more assertive, more knowledgeable in their localized domain at work, but still they can never break the shackles of that first impression that they are just an average, mediocre talent at best. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that you should gauge or calibrate your first impression based on your long-term goals. And that if you're in work or a career position where there's unlikely to be a continual refreshing or reevaluation of first impressions, like there is in school that has a very structured checking in, you should put in most of your energy early on and then slowly calibrate it backwards. That'll work to the best advantage of creating the ultimate first impression and overall character of yourself. Conversely, in a university setting or a school setting, the opposite is true. It actually behooves you, incentivizes you to play dumb, to put in less energy early on and create a negative impression of yourself that you can then build up over time. So now that we understand that the power of a first impression is almost unparalleled in the way humans develop their opinion of you, we can also use this to talk about interviews. Let's say you're out of school but don't have a full-time job yet. How should you approach interviews? Well, the same is true. Depends on the type of interview you're doing. If you recognize this as a more experienced career position, you should come across as confident, assertive, knowledgeable. And people in the back, after you've had that interview, will say, yes, he or she is certainly on top of their agenda. They know what they're talking about. You may or may not. But the perception that you've created is that you are indeed an experienced candidate. However, let's say you may be the most educated summa cum laude of your skill set engineer out of school, and you may be immensely smart, but you're young, and the only open positions for somebody like you at the moment are low-level positions. What should you do? Well, that tactic won't work, because in reality, the first impression they're looking for is somebody they can mold. When companies are looking for entry-level positions, associate-level positions, they're not so much looking for how assertive or how confident you are in the material or your technical ability. They're looking for somebody that has a raw intelligence, a friendliness, and somebody that they're willing to mold or get molded into the system. And I see this time and time again, especially in the background of interviews. We'll be shuffling, our pages upon pages upon pages of poor souls trying to get a job in this economy in the United States. And they'll talk amongst themselves saying, well, they seem like they had all the qualifications. They could certainly do the job well, but they seem like they know the system too well. And we don't want somebody that's, back-channeling on emails or trying to, seize a little bit of power. I don't want to have to deal with them as a kind of political opponent within the company. I want somebody we can mold, somebody that will listen to me when I give them directions and without questioning. Is this right or wrong? I'll let you decide. But this is what occurs. And so, even if you're the most qualified, smartest, most technically adept young candidate there is, it is often better to assume the first impression of one that is willing to be molded, that is willing to listen and take direction without questioning authority too often, at least until you get the foot in the door. That would be the tactical approach to creating a first impression that then you can manipulate later. The same thing can also be applied to first impressions of people. There's something to be said when you're first meeting a person, do play overly generous. This can be advantageous at first, but it works against you in the long term. When you act overly generous, you're paying for things, oh yes, I got money, whether this be interpersonal relationships, colleagues at work. The only thing you can do in the future is become less generous, because what's expected of you is that you will always be generous. Whereas if you start off miserly or a little more avarice, You can only grow more generous in the future, even if you are a generous person by nature. Manipulating that first impression, or setting it in a way that allows you to calibrate upward, starting out setting the baseline of, I don't like to spend money, I'm very cheap. And then, you go and buy a nice gift for a colleague or a nice present for a significant other. This suddenly cements and solidifies the idea that, they're really acting outside their character. They must really care about me. Whereas if you start, a gregarious, jovial, Santa Claus-esque figure, which may be your personality, and I'm totally for that personality. That's a great person to be. It may work against you in the end because people will expect that generosity from you in the future, even if you can no longer sustain it. It's all about first impressions and all about how you use that first impression in pursuit of your long-term goals, whether it be in school, whether it be in finding jobs, whether it be in keeping jobs. Interesting food for thought and some Machiavellian psychology here. Hopefully you found this video interesting or insightful. Let me know what you guys think down below. I'm curious your thoughts. Thanks for watching. See you guys tomorrow. Like, subscribe if you found this interesting. Thanks for watching, guys. See you tomorrow. Bye.